you OUP here in Spain for once again giving me the opportunity to collaborate with your work. I'm going to show you more or less what would appear to be equivalent or near equivalent. We have a series of sounds that are pronounced essentially in the same way, that are articulated in essentially the same way in Spanish and English, and these are the sounds which I've put up into the table here. This is great. This is common ground between the two languages. Similarly, there are lots of lists available in recognized handbooks for teachers on teaching pronunciation, but also now on the internet, of the sounds which are not part of how we pronounce Spanish. Deceptively similar, which is the third category and the one I invented for myself through my own experience, deceptively similar are actually all of the plosives. On the surface, it seems that Spanish p is the same as English p, and Spanish t is the same as English t. In practice, when we do closely compare the two languages, we discover that they are similar but not the same. The first way of exploiting the mother tongue is this business I call adding voice. And z is in all of the lists I found in recognized handbooks on pronunciation as not a Spanish sound. But of course, as you all know, if we take s and we simply add voice, we voice s, then automatically we've made z. And I've had virtually no problems in class with my students getting them to make s and then saying, can you vibrate it? And perhaps I show them what I'm doing when I go s, z, z. But simply by doing this, almost all of my students, almost always, are able to switch from s into z. So a sound which is technically not part of Spanish is accessed by beginning with Spanish, with a sound that is part of Castilian Spanish, and then simply adding voice. And in fact, there's a whole bunch of sounds of English that can be accessed from their unvoiced equivalent in Spanish. Once we've trained students, I always use this thumb and finger on my throat action to show I want voice from them. So here are 5 sounds that were in my initial lists, which I actually gathered from course books on how to teach the pronunciation of English, and which these books all identified as not being sounds of Spanish. But we can get to these sounds by merely starting with a Spanish consonant and adding voice. So the sound j, again, is identified by many handbooks on pronunciation as not part of Spanish, and therefore this will be very problematic for your students. And yet when I say to my students, can you do an Argentinian accent? And they start doing an Argentinian accent in front of me, and they say, yo me llamo. I say to them, okay guys, you're doing it. You can do this sound. And the minute they spot this, obviously it doesn't automatically become incorporated into their pronunciation, but it becomes a reference point. And when they say television, and they don't give me the j sound, I just refer them to an Argentinian flag, which I might carry with me to class for a few days, just to be able to hold up and say, remember, yo me llamo. Another thing I often do is play around. Rather than L1 accents, I suppose I ought to call this bilingual accents. But the alveolar articulation of t in English was one of those deceptively similar things when I compare English to Spanish pronunciation, because Spanish would use a dental t. With my students, I would then play backwards and forwards between these two articulations. And I'd say to them, I'm going to say T for two, and you have to tell me, am I saying it with an English t or a Spanish t? And therefore I'd say to my students something like T for two, and they say Spanish, Spanish, and I'd say, okay, T for two, and they go Spanish, Spanish, yeah, fine, T for two, and they go, whoa, that's so English, and I'd say, fine, can you do it? And they wouldn't necessarily be able to, and so I'd say, okay, let's say tetera, and they'd laugh because of my heavily English accented Spanish, and I'd say, no, laugh, but can you do the way I speak tetera? And they'd say, yeah, and the whole class could immediately put on a very English accent of Spanish and say tetera, and I'd say, okay, now say T for two like that. and then go T for 2 and say, fine, you've done it. Thank you everybody for having listened to what I've said, and I hope it's been useful to you. Neil, my apologies.
No problem at all, Robin. Thank you very much. That was really great. I think that was just a lovely mix of technical detail and practical classroom application as well. So thank you very much.